There's a story that the writer Anne Lamott tells in her book, Traveling Mercies. And it's a story about salvation through relationship. Or it might not actually be about salvation at all. It may just be a story about complaining, about a season of life where everything seems to go wrong, and on top of all the crap you're already dealing with, you end up falling into the mud, ruining your clothes and feeling sorry for yourself. But I think it's a story about salvation, about a particular mode of salvation. So in this story, Lamott, she shares this series of very unfortunate events that occurred for her over a period of about a month. It starts with a bad breakup with a lover. And then a dear friend of hers from church dies. And then a relative was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And oh, by the way, she ran out of money. And her young child grew a sty. She bounced a check. And her car then needed extensive repairs. And her friend, at the repair shop, loaned her a very large, purple, ugly car to drive around while hers was getting fixed. She roars out of the repair shop in her big, ugly, purple car and gets immediately stuck in traffic. In other words, it was one of those periods of time, I'm sure most of us can relate, where it kind of feels like the universe or God or karma or fate or whatever your outside force is has it in for you, particularly you, and is trying to make your life miserable and is succeeding. Now, Anne Lamott's writing this story about 20-some years ago. And so she didn't get to include, global pandemics, direct threats to democracy, or even the viral misery that spills out of social media feeds. But still, most people I know have had times in their life where it seemed like all the bad things were happening all at once, and even the stuff that really wouldn't bother us, that wouldn't be so bad normally, felt so much worse in the context of the pain and sorrow we were already in. It's those times when we've been gut punched so many times, so much, that even when the butterfly flits by, we flinch. Anyway, into this litany of pain and sadness and frustration and discomfort, a friend of Anne Lamott's comes to her home and invites her to go on a hike, which is both this kind of invitation of grace and kind of annoying at the same time, right? I mean, think of the last time you were deep in the mire of life, right? Suffering too many hits of sadness and anger and frustration, and at that moment where all you really want to do is curl up with a box of chocolates or ice cream and binge trashy television, right? Some chipper young soul comes dragging you out into the world, the last place you want to be. So anyway, Anne Lamott goes on the hike with her friend. And in fact, she thought, if I'm going to go on this hike and really try to raise my spirits, I'm going to get dressed up for it. Right? So she puts on this white linen blouse, these expensive walking sandals that she'd spent a lot of money on, even put on lipstick. And they go walking. And the walk and the hike does feel like a grace. She's just walking with a friend, and no one's trying to solve any problems. In fact, they're barely talking to one another. It's just two people. Someone falling into the abyss of sadness and regret of too many losses, and another just willing to be present to it. So they're walking along this path kind of next to a sort of marshy area. And Lamott describes what happens next. She says, quote, "And suddenly the ground and vegetation at our feet began to get a little watery. And then we began to hear sucking noises, swampy, quicksandy sucking noises. And pretty soon my overpriced walking sandals had been swallowed up by the mud." It's just another insult, right? Just another instance of when we are trying to pull ourselves out of our brokenheartedness, when we are pushing ourselves to regain our traction, our perspective, our untrammeled rhythm, the mud comes up and sucks us back down again. My wife and I had friends over for dinner the other night. That sounds unremarkable, but it has been a long time since we've had friends over for dinner. Leading up to the time before our guests arrived, I got a little anxious. I felt out of practice, right? Out of practice, by which I mean out of practice of how to actually be present to friendships, how to have conversations that may or may not devolve into pondering what has been lost in the last year and a half, how to share a meal, a drink, or a digressive, wandering conversation about nothing in particular and everything all at once, how to remember that pandemic means all people and wasn't actually directed to me specifically, or you specifically. Now, I, being who I am, probably thought too much about this, being out of practice in human relationships. But you know, I continue to observe us. Human beings are my favorite topic to observe. We're weird, by the way. We're really weird. But I observe how in our emergence we seem less sure of ourselves, less certain, more prickly, more demanding of one another than we may have been in the past, less forgiving, less graceful maybe. And then there are those of us, myself included sometimes, that are just trying to pump us out of our funk. Yeah? Anne Lamott reminds us, she tells a story about when she was a child, whenever her dad got sort of depressed, got sort of sad, the whole family would frantically try to pump him up out of it, right? Get him excited, get him back out in the world, right? And the theory was that if Dad was okay, then everybody else would be as well. But if Dad was not okay, we were all doomed. And in that little story she tells about her father, I read it with this sense that, you know, the family's just saying, if only we can get back to the way things were, we would be okay. Keep pumping. We'll be all right. So it turns out I need not have been too worried about my lack of practice in cultivating relationships. All I had to remember was just to be present, to let the stories flow, the frustrations and losses get laid out, the hopes and joys too. There was no need to pump our way out of the funk. The gumbo and the beer did a lot of that work for us. What we needed was just to sit in the mud together. And this, I think, is the thing, that this is the key thing about cultivating relationships in our lives. You gotta be willing to go into the mud with and for each other. We cannot be real and true in our common lives if all we want to do is be around the clean folk, the Instagram filtered ones with the good hair and the sparkling beach in the background. Because we know, right, deep down, that even those Instagram folks are sometimes dragged into the mire just like the rest of us. Cultivating, this idea, this term cultivating, its most fundamental meaning is to prepare the soil, to prepare the ground. And those of you who are, helping to dig the holes for our tree planting next weekend, or have gardened, or have tried to grow something from the ground, you got to get into the mud. And it means getting into the mud without fear or shame or whatever it is in us that always wants to be comfortable, wants our relationships to be clean and uncomplicated. It means reaching out and taking the hand of a friend, and without trying to fix them, not trying to advise them, and not trying to set them straight about whatever is going on in their lives, just sit with them in the mire. Just be present, listening for both the laughter and the tears. So Lamont says that now that they've crossed their way through this boggy part and she's lost her sandals, they're thwarted by this little embankment. Anyone who's gone hiking, runs into those kind of like short embankments that are all muddy and weedy. And as they try to climb their way back up to dry land, they slip again and fall again into the mud, laughing at the mess they've gotten themselves into. And it's at that moment Lamont begins to see the world as it is, right? Without trying to pump herself out of the funk. And she reflects on this, and this is what she writes. She says, "Against the sparkly black screen behind my eyes, all these people appeared, like people in a come-as-you-are fashion show, strangers to each other, but beloved by me. There were all the sick little kids we know, and all the friends who had died, Mimi and Ken Nelson and Mary Williams, and all the old people in my family and church who had grown so suddenly frail. And then there was the man whom I used to be in love, and who used to be in love with me. And I thought to myself, well, no wonder you're so sad. No wonder you're this sad." And as she's there, beside her is this friend who just needed to be present, to be mostly silent, right? But more importantly, to be willing to go into the mud with her friend. So I'm going to let Anne Lamott's words lead us to our close today. She writes this. She says, this is the most profound spiritual truth I know. That even when we're most sure that love can't conquer all, it seems to anyway. It goes down into that rat hole with us in the guise of our friends. And there it swells and comforts. It gives us second winds and third winds and 100th winds. It struck me that I've spent so much time trying to pump my way into feeling the solace I used to feel in my parents' arms. But pumping always fails you in the end. The truth is, your spirits don't rise until you get way down. It's because this mud at the bottom is where it all rises from. Maybe without it, whatever rises would fly off or evaporate before you could even be with it for a moment. But when someone enters that valley with you, that mud, somehow it saves you again. At that marsh, all that mud and one old friend worked like a tenderizing mallet. Where before there had been tough fibers, hardness, and held breath, now there were mud and dirt, water, air, mess, and I felt soft and clean. Friends, in our emergence, let us not rush to clean away the mud of our lives, nor try to wash it off the people we love. Let us be washed instead in the mud, dirt, water, air, and mess. It is from that mud that we will be saved. Amen, my friends. And I love you, and may we live in blessing.